Hi, everybody. Welcome to Unit 1, Topic 1 of IS 350, Sports and International Affairs. Today we'll be looking at the recognition of countries by each other in the international system, how that works, and how it might work in sport, and what that implies for different kinds of entities. I'm going to be using state and country as synonyms for each other to refer to independent entities. Sometimes I'll slip and use nation as a third synonym for the same concepts, an independent entity in the global system. Officially, a nation is something a little bit different. Again, it is used as a synonym by a lot of people and in our literature, but it can also refer to common groupings of people who share culture, heritage, language, ethnicity, religion, etc., which can be larger than a country, smaller than a country. They can be the same size as a country on rare occasions, but it's a nation that is of various sizes of that common cultural grouping. So sometimes we'll use it as a synonym. I'll try and clarify when I'm using it as a distinct term, and we'll go from there. So let's disappear me here and get further into our conversation. So we're talking first today about countries, recognitions, and what it takes to become a country, to become an independent state. Officially, you can just say, hey, I'm a state, we're independent, and whether someone recognizes you or not, you are on some level. The problem is that your ability to exercise a lot of the rights that come with being a state are limited if the other states don't recognize you, right? So I can say anything I want. I can say, here, my office is the independent state of whatever, of Smithville, but if the university turns off my electricity and my internet, then my ability to do what I want to do is pretty limited, right? And if I can't walk out my door, my office door, because they don't recognize my right to exist out there, I'm limited. So I could say I'm independent. I could say I'm a micronation, which is a pretty interesting thing. If you're ever curious, you can read up on Wikipedia. There's several dozen of these around the world that say, hey, we're independent, and everyone else says, no, you're not. So a better path would be to say, I'm an independent country and have another country recognize you. Because if you do that, then you have diplomatic relationships between one another. You can make treaties, you can have trade, you can exchange ambassadors, recognize the flag, etc. You have the right to exist with at least one other state. So you have this thing called the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus that perhaps some of you have heard of. Most people haven't. Most people haven't heard of it because it's a country recognized by one other country. The Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus came to independence in 1983. It was formed through an invasion of Turkey of the island of Cyprus. Instead of occupying the island, the part that they took over, they turned it over to another government. The government said, we're independent. Turkey said, great, we recognize you. And no one else ever has. It's just those two. And so the TRNC and Turkey, they can do all they want with treaty making and exchange of ambassadors and recognition of flags, etc. But it doesn't translate wider, right? That's still the idea that I can't walk out my door because no one else recognizes me. They can't do anything else in the rest of Europe or the rest of Asia or anywhere else because no one else recognizes them, but they can do things in Turkey. Kosovo is much further along. Kosovo is an entity that's got a lot more support. There's 77 other states there that recognize it. So they're one of 78 groups that have recognition one for another. They are located in the former Yugoslavia, which broke up rather spectacularly in the 1990s. And there's lots of entities that don't want to recognize it for a variety of reasons. So they've made it to 77, but no further. So the easy path is to say, I'm independent. Better path would be for someone to recognize you. Even better path would be to get lots of recognition. And ideally, you would do it through the official path. Because once you're accepted officially, then you have the right to exist in the international system. Everyone has to recognize you. And that official path comes through the United Nations. So the United Nations then would recognize you either through a combination of votes taken in the Security Council and the General Assembly, and once you get through 2/3 support of those, then you can become a member state. So there's currently 193. South Sudan was the newest in 2011, I believe. So it took them going through the Security Council and then going through the General Assembly. They had a 2/3 support of the 192. They actually had much more than that. Become independent, so there's 193. The good news then is that you have recognition from all of the other member states and can do all of that cool international stuff we were talking about before, where you can trade ambassadors, you can sign treaties, etc. Well, one of the things you get to do is send your folks out on passports. So that a passport is sort of an extension of diplomatic recognition to an individual who then carries with her or himself the right to that pertain to them in their home country. So if you accept a passport, if I take my passport and I go to Portugal, then when the Portuguese accept it, they're accepting the United States, the ability of the United States to project itself forward. So then if I was taking Smithville and I made my own passport and I walked to Portugal and I said, "Hi, I'm from Smithville," they would look at it and say, "I don't recognize your right to exist. I'm not going to accept you." But if they accepted it, they would be implying that I have the right to be an independent country, and it becomes complicated. So here's where some quirks of sport come in. One of the things we'll be looking at in this first unit is all the different kinds of entities that exist in sporting organizations that don't exist in the United Nations. They might be somewhere like the TRNC or Kosovo, where they have some rights but not all because some states recognize them. They might not be recognized by anyone as independent, but they'd like to have some sort of independence. They're quirky, they're unique. There's several dozen of these, and we'll be looking at them this unit. So as long as they then travel and they try and do things as their national, quote unquote, national team, right? They have a country of some sort, they have an entity of some sort that's competing in sports, they still then will have to travel on the passport of the parent country. Because if they try and travel on their own passports of Smithville or whatever, then they're going to run into trouble in the international system. So meet a pretty cool sporting story. It's the Iroquois national lacrosse team. So in lacrosse, unlike other sports, the Iroquois have a separate national team. You have the United States lacrosse, you have a Canadian lacrosse, and the Iroquois, who straddle the border between those two sovereign states, have their own lacrosse team. Okay, cool and neat. And the reason they get to do that is because of the cultural hearth of lacrosse, and they get to go to international championships, competitions, and compete. Well, several years ago, they tried to travel to the international competition in the United Kingdom using Iroquois national passports. So that's more complicated. It's one thing for the sporting organization, lacrosse, to extend recognition of the Iroquois as distinct from the two countries, Canada and the United States. It's another thing for the United Kingdom to decide to accept those passports because it implies something different. And it could have made the United States angry, could have made Canada angry, and it became a problem where the Iroquois nationals got stuck in the airport and missed the tournament because they wanted to travel on their own national passports. We'll look more at that example in an article and it'll become a little more clear later. But the quirk is that there's a bunch of entities that are not independent nations that are in sports that can do some actions but can't do everything because they're not sovereign, they're not states. Sporting organizations can basically recognize whomever it wishes. So an individual country, right, Turkey has the right to say, yes, TRNCU exists. And just because the other countries say, no, TRNC does not exist, doesn't stop Turkey from doing that. Sporting organizations can do the same thing. They can recognize whomever they wish as independent entities. This is a picture of a soccer game between Guadeloupe and the United States. What is Guadeloupe? Actually, this is a really funny picture because they both missed the ball. Anyway, Carlos Bocanegra here, who was captain of the United States national soccer team, retired in 2014 as a professional. He was captain of the United States in a competition called the Gold Cup. The Gold Cup happens every 2 years. It's a competition of 16 teams from the United States, from North America, Central America, and the Caribbean. So in international sporting organization, there is no Guadeloupe. But in a regional North America, Central America, and Caribbean competition, there is a Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe is a piece of France that's a lot like Hawaii. It's an overseas territory that's a fully integrated member, a part of France, right? They call them departments instead of states. It's a department of France. So they can't exist in the main international sporting organization because France doesn't want them to aspire to be independent, but they are recognized in the Caribbean region and they come to competition. So here you have the opportunity in sports for an quote unquote independent, distinct Guadeloupe, not independent because it's not a state, competing as a separate sporting entity. Okay, so what does this mean? So we're going to talk here about the difference between the United Nations recognition of a country and sporting recognition of a country. So why would you want sporting recognition? Because even if you're limited by the formal structure, you can't exist, quote unquote exist, because there's another entity preventing you from doing so, you can get some recognition. And once you are in with that smaller group, with that group, you can have wider recognition therein. For example, in basketball, and in the Olympics and several other things, there's a distinct Puerto Rico. There's a Puerto Rican national team, quote unquote national team. Now, Puerto Rico doesn't have a nation, doesn't have a country. You could say there are Puerto Ricans who are in a nation, that's that definition of culture, language, etc. But they have a separate national team in some sports. So once they get that recognition there, they have some independent standing, some distinctiveness from the United States. And in fact, several years ago, then Puerto Rico played the United States in basketball in the Olympics. Pretty interesting because they're both the United States. Okay, so we're going to link these ideas, formal diplomatic recognition and informal recognition through sports, and see what an entity can get if they get that recognition. So we will scooch to this next topic and go from there. All right, so we're going to start with the example we're going to use is China, and we're going to start in 1949. 1949, China had a revolution. The nationalists and the communists fought each other. The nationalists, led by Chiang Kai-shek, who's this fellow here on the right, fled to Taiwan. The communists, led by Mao Zedong, occupied mainland China. So one of the complicating factors is as Chiang Kai-shek fled, they said, we're China. They didn't say we're Taiwan. They said we're China, and that those guys are the usurpers. They're illegal, and we should be China. So at the United Nations, there's an ability to have one country called China. What you had was two entities both claiming to be China. And for about 30 years, you had a situation where some countries in the world wanted to recognize mainland China as China, and some wanted to recognize Taiwan as China. And in the Security Council of the United Nations, it was Taiwan that had the recognition. So until the mid-1970s, when you went to see these big meetings, big international meetings, the huge, giant China was not present. It was the small nationalist China on the island of Taiwan that was. But for the Olympics, it was a little more confusing. And for sports, it was a little more confusing because they had, as the two split, the members of the Olympic members went to both places, and they both said, we're China. And what the Olympics was able to do and the soccer was able to do is find a place between the formal recognition of one and the lack of recognition for the other, and let there see if there could be recognition of both. Now, this is complicated, and there's a really good article I've assigned for this unit that'll let you read more about China and sport. But it really comes to a head. So at each Olympiad, every 4 years, from 1949 into the 1990s, you had this challenge of having two entities called China trying to show up and compete and participate and play. And that's a problem when they didn't like each other. There's a lot of fighting about it. It comes to a head in the 1991 Women's World Cup. It's the first Women's World Cup. It's hosted in China. And in the qualifying system, which we'll look at later, Taiwan qualified to go to the event. The problem was that China didn't recognize Taiwan's right to exist. And the question was, now what? What do you do? And it sort of forced the mainland Chinese to figure out how to recognize other entities that are China. So in sports, you actually have four Chinas. You have mainland China and Taiwan. Taiwan not given the right to exist by China. They're not allowed to use their flag. They actually compete using these symbols here. This is their soccer flag. They have an Olympic flag, they have a cycling flag, etc. You also have Macau, which was a Portuguese possession that returned to mainland China in the mid-1990s, and Hong Kong, which is a British possession which returned to China also in the 1990s. And those, because of their prior heritages, are allowed to compete as separate Olympic teams, separate soccer teams, etc. So there's actually in the Olympics four Chinas, three of which China recognizes as part and parcel of it, and a fourth that's called Chinese Taipei in an agreement. You can read about that again later. So there's this interesting overlap between the diplomatic recognition through the United Nations and the informal recognition that comes from sports. So Chinese Taipei then, or Taiwan, has a measure of recognition that matters to them because they still exist on some level. All right. A takeaway. And what does this all mean? All right, so aspirant countries are going to look for recognition wherever they can. And when you see this on a screen, these final screens that says takeaway, please, on your notes, this is what I want you to formally write down. When you're studying for midterms and stuff, you want to know this is the thing you want to know. The details and stuff will be to support this main takeaway. So you're trying to exist, right? And you go all the way from a micronation to a country recognized through the international system in the United Nations, and then all kinds of things in between where states are using sports or cultural organizations or some way to be recognized. The advantage of sports is you've got uniforms, you've got flags, you've got anthems, you've got national teams. And if you have a national team, maybe you have a nation. And that's sort of the point here. Thanks for listening, and we'll head on to topic 2. Don't forget the readings, the bonus bits, and any other things I've got assigned for this. Cheers.